Hello, everybody. My name is Michelle Miller-Fisher, and I'm a curator in the Contemporary department at the MFA, and it's my pleasure to welcome everybody this evening for a conversation with the esteemed author, artist, professor, and thinker, Dr. Nell Painter. And Rachel is going to offer a bio for Dr. Painter momentarily. Before we start, we want to thank both the Contemporary Circle and the Black Art and Artists Circle. This is a joint event this evening, and so it's lovely to be together. We've invited Dr. Painter to be in conversation with us this evening to celebrate an unusual and pretty special curatorial project at the MFA, an online project called Black Power in Print, which we've been working on as a team with many of our colleagues at the museum over the last year, and which went live on October 15th. So Rachel is going to moderate a conversation with Dr. Painter for about 30 or 35 minutes, after which we're going to have time for questions. So we encourage you to put questions in the chat throughout the evening. And just a very gentle reminder on Zoom etiquette that we'd be very grateful if you could remain on mute during the presentation until we get to the Q&A. So before Rachel and Dr. Painter take the digital stage, I'd like to offer a very brief 3-minute overview of the Black Power in Print project for context for those of you who haven't seen it. And I'll pop this link in the chat in a minute after I've shared the PowerPoint. So Black Power in Print centers upon the work of Boston-based artist and activist Dana Chandler, both in terms of an artwork, Fred Hampton's Door 2 from 1974, that you see on the left of the screen here, which entered our collection in 2020, and a text, a manifesto that arrived at the MFA in 1970, 50 years prior. Dana Chandler created the artwork Fred Hampton's Door 2 in 1974 after the theft of a smaller original artwork, a painting that was made in 1970. And both of these works commemorated the violent police murder of a young Black Panther Party member in Chicago, Fred Hampton. Right around this moment in time, Chandler also created a hugely powerful document titled A Proposal to Eradicate Institutional Racism at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. He wrote it in 1970, and his manifesto challenged the MFA and, by inference, similar institutions to represent Black artists in their collections and exhibitions, and critically, to financially support Black self-determination in the arts. His proposal not only asked the museum to collect the work of Black artists, but to support Black curators and Black museum administrators. And he laid out in his manifesto a very clear budget for this alongside a staff structure. It's a document that feels like it might have been written yesterday. Chandler's rallying cry helped push the MFA to stage the exhibition Afro-American Artists, New York and Boston in spring 1970. He was one of the 70 artists featured, and he showed a portrait of Black Panther Party National Chairman Bobby Seale, as well as the painting you just saw that marked the recent murder of Fred Hampton. So in 2020, 50 years after that exhibition, the MFA acquired the work that you just saw, Fred Hampton's Door 2, which was the second and only surviving version of Chandler's seminal painting for our permanent collection gallery. For our permanent collection. In 2019, the Museum of Modern Art in New York acquired an archive of the Black Panther newspaper published between 1967 and 1980. And it came into my old department in architecture and design because of our former colleague, Achille Tomasino, who had them in his personal collection and donated them to MoMA. That got us talking between the two institutions at MoMA and the MFA over the last year or so. And this image gallery is part of the nucleus of the online exhibition, Black Power in Print, that we're talking about today. The Black Panther newspaper was designed and illustrated by Emory Douglas, as many of you know. He was the Black Panther Party's Minister of Culture. And the newspaper defined the party's signature visual identity, while its pages chronicled the same national and international struggles examined in Chandler's manifesto and art. So we've gathered images from the Black Panther newspapers at MoMA, which have been very recently digitized. So for the first time are really available to many more people to take a look at online much more widely. We've also gathered images that tell Dana Chandler's story here in Boston as part of the local and wider movement for Black Power. There's a fantastic archives, and Liz has done so much work on this as part of Northeastern's university archives. So the online project, which you see just a screenshot of just here, is a collaboration between the MFA and MoMA, and it acknowledges the belated institutional recognition of these foundational documents and artworks as part of a broader examination of the Black Power movement's legacy in visual culture. So this digitization has given us the opportunity to show part of this story online as never before. There are new interviews between artists and scholars that provide new historical analysis. One of my favorites is the conversation that Liz had between Dana, his daughter Dana, and this was also commemorated online in a live program that I think some of you were able to attend. There's a really fantastic reflection from Maureen Melton, who's been the MFA archivist for quite some time, about how she came to find Dana Chandler's manifesto. A story actually from a point of view that I don't think has really been foregrounded often in museum histories, but is incredible, really an interesting read. And then we have a conversation between Dr. Kelly Morgan, who has recently come to be the director of the Curatorial Studies program at Tufts, and Shanoa Baker, who was over the summer, this summer, our Black Arts and Artists intern at the MFA. And so without further ado, with this backdrop and with this particular project in mind, we're incredibly grateful and glad that Dr. Painter has come to speak a little bit about her work and about the context of this project. And I'm very glad to turn the mic to Reto, who will introduce our wonderful guest. So Reto, over to you.
Thank you, Michelle, for your introduction, and a really warm welcome to our supporters from two curator circles, Black Art and Artists and the Contemporaries. And I want to express my deep gratitude to everyone at the MFA who has helped with making Black Power in Print a reality. This is a special project that was developed during a special time, and it needed a set of special, dedicated people to bring it to life. So thank you, Michelle and Liz in DCA, and Akili as a former member of our department, as well as Dominique, Jill, Catherine, Megan, Sarah, Maggie, Jane, Marie, Janet, Matthew, and James at the MFA, and the many brilliant minds who have contributed outside the institution. And I'm very happy to give a very brief, way too brief for all she has achieved introduction to Nell Painter. Nell is a scholar, a teacher, a writer, recognized by some of the most venerable institutions. She is the Edwards Professor of American History Emerita at Princeton University. In addition to her earned doctorate in history from Harvard University, she has received honorary doctorates from Wesleyan, Dartmouth, and Yale, amongst others. She has published widely, most notably maybe The History of White People in 2010, and numerous essays and op-eds. The one I want to call out, as it is directly related to tonight's program, is Seeing Police Brutality Then and Now, published in the New Yorker in 2020, discussing the Black Panther Party's creation of a visual archive of justified outrage through the lens of recent protests against police brutality. But the story does not end here, as Nell is also a visual artist who came to that second calling at a later stage in life. A fact that she beautifully talks about in Art School, published in 2008, which the local Boston Globe called a, I quote, feisty and delightfully irreverent memoir, a coming-of-age story for the over 60 said. The most impressive portrait that she achieves here is her own, an unstoppable force tethered to an iron will. And that could go on for a long time, but mostly I just wanted to say at this point, we are really honored to have you with us tonight, Nell. Thank you.
Thank you, Reto.
As Michelle mentioned, I have a few questions prepared to frame this conversation and tie it to Black Power in Print. And we invite everyone to put your questions in the chat whenever you have one, or send them to me or Michelle directly. We will make sure to leave enough time at the end to discuss them. Now, when we last spoke, I think it was 2017 or 18, and it was in Cleveland on a stage in front of a few hundred people.
Yes.
A lot has changed since. For one, we are talking on a screen.
Yeah.
We're still facing a global pandemic, but we have also experienced some of the largest protests in the history of this country in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. I wonder, have these shifts changed your own focus? That is, like your commitment to a career as a visual artist and that of being a historian?
Yes, that's the short answer. But first, let me make one slight correction in your very generous introduction. Old in Art School was published in 2018.
Correct. That
Okay.
wouldn't make sense.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I went to art school between 2006 and 2011. I had to struggle a long time to pull together the academic side of myself, the historical side of myself. I always knew that I had fantastic subject matter to draw on, but I didn't know how to combine discursive meaning and visual meaning. It's taken me 10 years to do that. And I did that in many steps along those years. 2020 made a different turning in my artwork in which I directly addressed what was going on. I made 3 pieces. The longest one, I call them artist books, but they're not artist books in the sense that the people who make artist books make artist books. I mean, they're not little sculptures and they're not folded. They're more like regular books. The first one, which I made in Italy and finished just as the pandemic was arriving, was American Whiteness Since Trump. So it was going to be more like a picture book of history, of recent history. But since the pandemic closed down everything, that little book has 26 pages, but it ends before the pandemic, before the election, before January 6th. So it's kind of, it's frozen in time. But at any rate, so that was facing the world that was happening since 2016. And then I made a piece in June called From Slavery to Freedom, which was my response to the outpouring of anti-racist sentiment at the time. And I used the title From Slavery to Freedom of a classic history of Black Americans, first published in 1947 by John Hope Franklin. It's a book that I grew up with, and why I always had looked askance at the history I was taught in institutions like my schools and my colleges, even my graduate school. And then finally, I made a little confessional piece called I Knit Socks for Adrian. And it was about being stuck up in the Adirondacks for such a long time, away from my wonderful multiracial, multicultural arts community in Newark, New Jersey, where I live. And in that piece, I came out publicly as a knitter, which was really hard for me to do. So the last piece was very personal, and the second one was very topical, and the first one was going to be a kind of historical take. It's very talky, but it's, you know, it's all images. So those were the 3 pieces that I made last year, and all 3 were different from what I had ever done in art or in history.
I will, next time we talk, I will add the knitting to your bio.
Okay, so
Something to add to your biography.
this sweater, I knit it. Can't really see it, but it's a great sweater.
So I want to sort of take a long step back and go to sort of the beginning of your life. And you grew up on the West Coast
I grew up in Oakland.
Area. And at that time, I was wondering, were you aware of Dana Chandler, or more generally, how would you describe your view and understanding of the Black Power movement back then? Was that one that was mostly local, or already sort of like, you know, you had sort of a sense of like a national movement?
Yeah, well, I was born in 1942, so I'm before everything. I grew up in the 50s. There was no Black Power. There was a civil rights movement that I was well aware of, not because I was taught anything about it in school, but I come from a very lefty family. We were counterculturalist in the sense that I grew up with John Hope Franklin and W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, with all those people who told me that there was another way of seeing where we are in the world and what our history was, and even what our art was. So I grew up with Charles White, Elizabeth Catlett, Jacob Lawrence, early Romare Bearden. But I also took drawing lessons at what was then called the California College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland. And there, Richard Diebenkorn was no longer teaching there, but his style and his ideas and his vision were very much a part of what I learned when I was in high school. And I also really loved Ben Shahn. So that's the kind of art that I grew up with. I did not know about artists working in the East Coast. I didn't come east until 1969. So that's when my knowledge started. And at that point, then we're in the Black Power era. And I also came to know the art of Dana Chandler.
So one aspect of Black Power in print is an attempt really to point out the connections between various and more local histories. And we also try to do that in New Light, the exhibition that is currently on view at the MFA, in which Dana Chandler's powerful work that Michelle showed in her presentation for Hampton's Door #2
Yes.
is a conversation with a painting by Benny Andrews, whose activism was mostly focused on the New York art scene, for example, through the foundation of the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition.
Yes.
And then to sort of go one step further, the Moroccan French artist Bouchra Khalili, that is also featured in Black Power in print online, also talks about the Black Panther Party's international connections and the role of international solidarity in the struggle of equality. As a historian, at which point in your career and how exactly did these various histories of protests start to really form a larger, more holistic picture?
Larger holistic picture is ongoing. So for instance, early this year, I finished an essay on Alma Thomas for the Alma Thomas retrospective. It's in the catalog. And there I learned about Benny Andrews's work, which actually paved the way for her getting the show at the Whitney. So, you know, Benny Andrews and the activity of David Driscoll and Barry Gaither, all those people came together for me. I knew each of those names, but I didn't know how they worked to shape the way we see 20th century art. So that was something that I learned just last year in the life of Alma Thomas. But as far as art history, I really focused on it when I started art school as a BFA student at Mason Grove School of the Arts at Rutgers in 2006. When I was an undergraduate, I was briefly at Berkeley, I was briefly an art major, but not long enough to really learn more than a class in Asian art, which I adored, but I didn't study American art. I thought Ben Shahn was the beginning and the end, kind of, for canonical artists. And let me say about Black Power, I was also in the same high school class with Huey Newton. It was a great big class. We were in very different parts of it, but he stood out because he was so handsome and he wore a suit to high school every day. You know, I didn't really know him personally, but I certainly knew of him. And when I was in college at Berkeley, I knew about the Black Panthers, but I never got really close because of two problems for me. One was their fascination with guns and with personal violence. And the other was that they were so sexist. I mean, I know that there were very strong women like Elaine Brown and the women who ran the breakfast program. There were women who were absolutely essential. But for me, the sexism was just a terrible stumbling block.
It's I mean, and this is maybe a perspective that we as MFA colleagues share and reminisce that might not be accurate, but I have a sense that you mentioned Barry Gaither and his brilliant work to showcase in the 1970s the work of Black artists really on a national stage. I have a sense that because that happened in Boston, it still isn't quite sort of recognized at the same level than the work of artists and curators who were, acting in New York and maybe some also on the West Coast. Is that a perception that you share?
Yes, in two ways. One, I've often said about scholars that colleges and universities often think that the only really smart Black scholars are the ones who were elsewhere, and they trivialize the ones who are local, thinking, oh no, they're not really good enough. So there's that, it's sort of the prophet who's ignored at home. There's that. The other thing is that the United States art world is so focused on New York. I mean, I live in New Jersey, and you would think that New Jersey was, I don't know, Idaho or something, because the people I went to the Rhode Island School of Design with, they knew they were going to move immediately to Brooklyn and become international artists. I knew I was coming back to Newark. I had a wonderful place to come back to with the Faro Gallery, my first residency. But I was and remain a local artist, a New Jersey artist. I am not an artist. And I'm sure that all of that, not being in New York and being the person who is local, played into really kind of the handicaps that Barry had to face as he did his wonderful work. Without the show that he put together, I think he called it New York Artists, and Elma Thomas was from Washington, DC, but she was in that show and she got noticed, and that gave her a real step forward.
Yeah, I think the exhibition was called Black Artists, Boston and New York.
Yeah, Boston.
It was sort of like putting together those two.
But no DC.
Right. So in your brilliant essay in the New Yorker from last year that I mentioned in my introduction, you observed that, I quote, the 20th century anti-racist art by Emory Douglas and others inspired by the Black Panther Party and Black Power has hardly been rediscovered, end quote. Do you feel that more recent focuses on the work of artists of color and in particular Black artists in US museums include steps towards such an overdue rediscovery, or does it still happen more or less without the context of a longer historical arc?
Both. We have to do both. The program that I watched this afternoon from Radcliffe about Eileen Southern was part of cultural reparations. One thing that's been very hard for people to see in our history is that the age of segregation, well, on the one hand, it hasn't quite ended, but it's very different now from what it was in 2010 or 2000, and very different from what it was in the 20th century. So I see, looking around, and I support reparations for people actually in my generation, or people born before 1968, whose careers were crippled by sexism and racism and ableism, even because the era of blindness, of segregation, of exclusion really went all the way through the 20th century.
Because I mean, I think you're, I find this interesting, you're an artist who is sort of came to a second career as an artist late in life, but I think what we're looking at with someone like Dana Chandler, for example, is an artist who, really late in his career, but at long last, and thankfully during his lifetime is getting some of the recognition that he long deserved. And Dana Chandler for sure is not alone, and there's many more. And even if I flip through Barry Gaither's brilliant catalog, you know,
Yes.
that includes
Yes.
70 artists, like the list of artists who, you know, still remain to be, whose work remains to be discovered is a very long one. How do you, so to come back to this question, how do you feel about museums sort of like tackling both, sort of like, you know, this pressure of like looking at who's doing really brilliant work now at the as broad as possible scale, but also really looking back in history and trying to do some of that very, very necessary work of recognizing those who have long been overlooked?
Yeah, the second part is harder because of the art world's fixation on youth. It's so much easier to glom on to elevate the artists who are doing trendy stuff. One of the things I said in Olden Art School was that one of my teachers at RISD said that one of the most important things in your art is to be doing things that are saying right now. But that's not something I can fully do because I have such a long history myself. But right now was so much more fashionable than recuperating work that was done, say, in 1980 or 1970, or even 1990. In our earlier conversation, I mentioned a couple of artists, women who are my age and who thankfully are still alive, because a lot of the people my age are not alive, unfortunately, or people who got snuffed out when they were younger, who got so discouraged, or who had so many other responsibilities, and when they were not being supported, their careers fell by the wayside. The fantastic printmaker Margot Humphrey, who is from Oakland, we took drawing classes together at CCAC. She made a wonderful career at Maryland, but she is not in good health. And Anne Lovelace O'Neill, the California painter, who is still painting, in 2019, she did have a retrospective in the Munchin Gallery in New York. So she is still around. I hope she is still around, because that was a little over a year ago. But there's wonderful work that is yet to be discovered because of the prejudice against age.
So let's go to Dana Chandler's manifesto, which is sort of like at the center of Black Power and print for a moment. So in his manifesto, titled "A Proposal to Eradicate Institutional Racism at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts," from 1970, that was almost exactly 5 decades ago.
Yeah.
Hard to believe. In it, he challenged the MFA to represent Black artists in their collections and exhibitions and to financially support Black self-determination in the arts. And while some progress for sure is being made, it is striking that some of Chandler's demands could have, as Michelle also said, been really made yesterday and addressed, I would say, almost interchangeably to almost any American museum.
Yes. Not the Newark Museum of Art. Since its founding, the Newark Museum of Art has had the soul of a public institution and also showed Black artists in the 1940s.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely acknowledge, you know, that there has been some museums that have done incredible work over a long period of time. But I think like sort of the bulk of the institutions, if you look at Chandler's demands, seem to be, you know, like struggling with addressing more or less the same questions. And then what do you think can we learn from looking back at that manifesto?
The easy part is, look, here's the guideline. You don't have to make it up from scratch. That's one thing. And since Dana Chandler himself is still around, you can ask him, well, you know, how would you change this? Would you change this? So there's two ways that you in Boston are already ahead of the game. The other way is to face up to something that's really hard for American white people, and that is to say, we don't know. And one question that you asked me earlier is, as we were having our preliminary discussions, is it easier to do now? And I said, yes, it is. And one of the big reasons, there are two big reasons, I would say. One is that white people are less ignorant than they used to be. And with that, I would say also less proud of their ignorance. And the other is we have so many more Black people and people of color who have access to public discourse. In 1970, we had James Baldwin, but who else could reach a wide public? Now we have a whole panoply of people who are saying things that need to be said. I mean, there have been people saying things that need to be said all along, but those people are being heard. And the example I use is Ta-Nehisi Coates. His father was a Panther, interestingly enough, but could not get his views onto the national stage. So the public discourse is more open now than it was 50 years ago for voices of color. One difference, though, is that since there are so many people talking, the people in responsibility have to take the responsibility of judging what's right for their particular institution. They can't just turn it over to the Black person at hand and say, here, you fix it.
I mean, what you said at the beginning of your response to my question, I think is really true, and we share that. I think within our department, that I think Chandler's manifesto is beautifully hands-on and pragmatic, right? It's not just sort of like a philosophical treatise on some airy questions, but he's really giving,
Really?
down to, a budget.
Wow.
And so this feels, as you say, it feels actionable, right? So, and I think that is something that makes this so resonant in our times. It's like a step-by-step playbook in terms of how to achieve some of these demands that he's asking, which if you read it, it actually doesn't sound that hard, right? I'm not saying that the work we have to put into this isn't going to be incredibly hard, and it's continued work, but I find it really fascinating to think about a manifesto in that sort of down to earth way and addressed to one institution. I have my last question, and then we can maybe open it up to questions from the audience. I have some more written down, but when we look at sort of the recent anti-police brutality protests in 2020 and more recent chapters of Black Lives Matter, I wonder, sort of on the other end of the spectrum, what makes these more recent developments distinct from those more historical aspects that we just talked about, and how do we have to look at these differently and interpret them differently?
I don't know about interpreting them differently, but I think the eyes are more open. So, for instance, in 1970, the powers that were might well all have been upper middle class white men, people of wealth and power. And I think that the power has been distributed a little bit more widely now, which is good. So we have differences in the power structure, and we have differences in the audience. And then I would just turn back to changes in white people's frame of mind, and the number of non-white people who can be heard, who not only have things to say within their own respective professional circles. So you and in the museum have people in the museum to talk to you, and you know that you're sharing professional standards and professional ideals. 50 years ago, that would have been much harder.
I've one last question for you as an artist, not as a historian in the first place, but I think one of the many achievements of Emory Douglas, now going sort of to the Black Panther newspaper, was that he was able to develop such a distinct and powerful visual language that was really giving,
Yes,
you know, a visual voice to words mostly, as appearing as text in those newspapers. Is there something you personally were able to learn from Emory Douglas's sort of visual archive?
I don't think so. Remember that my career as an artist is fairly short. So it was compressed. So I was in captivity in art school for 6 years, and I've had 10 years now of freedom. And I've been working through my own background in history and developing my own visual language. So for me, Emory Douglas was not an immediate influence, but he was in the world that I lived in, not in my art school world, but in the world that I lived in. And I always knew, as I told you, I come from a very left-leaning family, so I always knew there was a place for engaged art. And so I never had any hesitation about being an engaged artist.
So to open this up a bit more, who are artists you were or are looking at in a more direct way?
You mean when I was in art school or now?
I think now, maybe both.
Now, there are two artists who have shows up right now who engage with history and engage with text. One is Glenn Ligon, and one is Adam Pendleton. So, you know, those are very much on my mind right now. When I was in art school, I really took a lesson from Faith Ringgold when she said, when she heeded her friend Florence Kennedy's, who said, write your own damn self. So I write my own damn self. And I love Faith Ringgold's story quilts, which really do the text and the images together, which is something that I do also. I always loved the portraits of Alice Needle. Let's see, who else? I thought of myself as a figurative painter when I was in art school, and I have grown more, I go back and forth between figuration, history, and abstraction. But in that, that transit back and forth, I actually found Andy Warhol very helpful.
I like that arc from Warhol to Faith Ringgold to Glenn.
And back, yeah.
And Adam and back, yeah. From A to B and back again. Quite beautiful. So we're at almost 6:45. So I would like to open this up to any questions. You can ask questions by, you know, muting yourself. We're a rather small group here on the screen, or you can also raise your hand and then unmute yourself, or you can just put your questions right into the chat if you have any. Have you, as you were sort of studying Black Power in print, Nell, what was the one thing that you maybe didn't know about or discovered for yourself?
I really would love to hear Dana Chandler talk about how he juggled the imperatives from the needs of the time and his own eye and his own sense of what his hand wanted to make. So for instance, I saw Fred Hampton's door too at Sullivanation at Crystal Bridges. So that was actually before you acquired it.
And I think you reviewed that show.
I did. Yeah,
yeah.
I reviewed it twice, actually. I reviewed the catalog and then I reviewed the actual show. That is in the New York Review of Books. But when you and I talked, you talked about Dana's sense of kind of a mission that from time to time he might have felt as a little constricting. So he was such a wonderful artist. I first encountered him as someone who was thinking not only about sort of the Black community writ big, or the local sort of the Boston area community, but also as workers' rights as well. So I know that he had many, many interests in what he felt the community needed. But I wonder if what he would say about what he felt he needed as a visual artist. So I guess I'm trying to make a distinction between the formal qualities of his work and the social qualities of his work, and how he balanced those in a long career.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I will say, like, we're working on an exhibition on the work of Frank Bowling, which will open in fall next year. But like, there too, like, sort of the struggle between really being taken serious as an artist first and foremost, really to focus, you know, for the audience and critics to focus on the formal qualities of and the innovation part of that of an artist versus the social aspects of with, you know, as an artist with a certain background is really something that comes for in his work and in his own writings in very interesting ways. Michelle, you have raised your hand.
I have. I was going to ask you a question as well. I love your question, Dr. Painter. I feel like, Liz, you have some thoughts because we have a shortened version of the interview with Dana Chandler, but you sat for him with hours and hours and hours of transcripts. My question is about gender. I was so struck, Dr. Painter, several times you mentioned, for example, the real sexism of the Black Panther Party, for example. You talked about the art world's fixation with youth, and I think the other fixation it has is gender. It's pretty hard to be, or has historically been hard to be, an artist who does not identify as a man and get yourself into galleries and museums. And then you mentioned Florence Kennedy, whose history in Boston. I remember reading about the Boston Peon when I first came to this city and being completely blown away by that particular piece of activism. And so this notion of writing your own damn self, having many imperatives to it, but one being that history of being able to write your own destiny as a woman. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit more, expand a bit more on that inflection of gender and institutions, whether it's the art world, whether it's the Black Panthers, or whether it's sort of society at large, both personally and maybe how you've seen that and encountered that in wider ways.
Yeah, I could talk about that for a long time.
I wish you would, because I'm so interested in your thoughts on it.
One of the reasons I mentioned my age is because I grew up in a much more constricted world, a world in which being a woman was so much more of a handicap than it is now. Of being a Black woman was so much more of a handicap than it is now. And of being a dark-skinned woman was so much more of a handicap than it is now. So all of these are part of what influenced where I went in my life. So I didn't become a Black Panther. I didn't embrace Black power entirely because of the sexism. I naturally felt drawn to to left-wing historians who, because I was a middle-class Black woman, wouldn't even, deal with me seriously or my work seriously because of class issues and race issues. So the places where I haven't been often reflect the isms that I've had to deal with. In addition to that, the kind of work I make, I mean, I'm very proud now of the kind of work I make, which is something only I can make. But it is not the kind of work that's going to get me on the covers of any magazines or, great big shows and all that sort of thing. And I'm glad that I'm an old person because I already am. I don't have to take my clues of my meaning, my value from a world that's obsessed with youth or obsessed with 6-foot wide paintings. So there's a kind of freedom that comes from having lived a life that was rooted for so many decades in all the isms in a funny way.
Thank you for that. I want to say I've been reading your book. My husband went back to
Oh,
art
yeah.
school. He went back to art school age 40.
Oh, yes.
He was the oldest kid in his class. And so I've
Sure.
been reading aloud
Sure.
paragraphs from your book.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I could ask you many more questions. I want to let somebody else have a chance. I don't know if there are
Thank
other
you for
questions
that.
in the chat. If others have questions, please feel free. You can either ask them anonymously if you feel a little shy. You can put them in the chat if that's easier, or you can just unmute if you'd love to. I feel like, Liz, you have one on the tip of your tongue, maybe.
I do, but I don't want to jump in front of everybody. I'll go though, and please somebody get queued up behind me. Yeah, I mean, I would never dare to speak for Dana. Dana is one of the most eloquent and outspoken people I've ever had the honor of being in conversation with. But to your point now about if he had felt, restricted by the social obligations of being a Black painter in a time of such violence towards Black people. I mean, he did challenge bowling, as Rato's alluding to, in saying, how can you paint anything but something that creates change and awareness amongst your people and amongst white people? And particularly, I think he was restricted in also the location, the site of his work, and choosing to be a muralist. It wasn't so much a choice as a decision, because his audience was primarily Black people. Black people were not welcome in museum spaces and white institutions. So he took to the outdoors, not because, he had this desire to create these huge paintings on buildings, but because there was no other way to reach the audience that he cared about so deeply. So I wonder now, in your own work, and maybe this is a question both for you as an artist and you as a historian, you said that your work is engaged and socially engaged, but how do you feel about this sense of obligation to engage with social contexts, maybe both as an artist and then thinking about peer artists of color who I'm sure are faced with similar question?
Yeah, for artists who are faced with similar questions, that really is up to each artist. It depends on where you are, who you are, what your circumstances are. People often ask me if I have any advice for old people thinking about going to art school. And I say, think about your own situation and what you want to do, but also what you can do. And I mentioned the unmentionable, that is money. Art school is really expensive. It's expensive in time, it's expensive in tuition and room and board and all that. But also when you come out, you don't have a living wage skill. So the first thing is to think about what it means to your pocketbook. Do you have children? Do you have responsibilities for older parents? All of those things. So I can't decide for other people, but I can say that being older gives you a kind of groundedness and, well, wisdom that younger people don't have. So you're steadier, you know yourself better, you know how to find the allies you need, and you know how to tell somebody that's bullshit.
I want to expand a bit on that, because I do think personally for myself, and I think for the entire department, it's been, I think, the greatest joy in Black Power in Print is our ability to sort of like go back to the wisdom of like generations before us who have, you know, expressed some of these, have expressed responses to some of these like really urgent and continually urgent questions so so concisely. And so I do think we've always thought about this project as an archival project.
Good.
As sort of like, you know, an opportunity to create an archive for future generations to continue to learn from, to build upon. And so I do think what you just said, Nell, is really resonant in many ways.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, Reto, but I also think there's something you can do that would fill a gap that's not quite, you don't have to have millions to do what I'm going to suggest. And let me look back to some work that I did in 2015. I made 2 little artist books called Art History by Nell Painter, Volume 27, and Art History by Nell Painter, Volume 28. And I was looking back at the African-American discussion around art in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And one of the frustrations that came up over and over again, and it also lay at the founding of Spiral in New York in the 60s, was that the artists hungered for commentary about their work. And so a program that simply published, 500 words, 1,000 words on artists that artists could have in their hand and say, look, it's called your bibliography. It's what people see in your work. That is so valuable for artists. And it's something that Black artists, at least, have needed for more than 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll take that to heart. I think, Michelle, you wanted to say something.
I was going to ask 2 things. I was going to say 2 things. We currently have an exhibition up right now, Dr. Painter, of Helena Metaferia's work. She's an Ethiopian American artist, and she looks specifically at matrilineal histories of the Black Power movement. And so she has interviewed, for one of the works that we have on display in the gallery, she's interviewed descendants of Frederick Douglass and James Baldwin, and she really thinks so beautifully about female figures who have been absolutely indispensable to moving history forward, but have not been centered in the same way, certainly don't have the same name recognition. And one of the things we discussed was exactly what you just said, which is why we're publishing a book on the side. Right. She said, I want someone to write about my work. I need that. When the exhibition is over and done with, I need that to be there, and I need somebody to be able to validate what I've done here. And so we found a really fantastic author who wrote a short essay, and then I did an interview with her, but it wasn't just me, actually. It was our amazing intern, Shanoa Baker, who is the Black Arts and Artists summer intern from 2020. So that was her first in-print publication as a young emerging curator of color too. So I think there's both sides. It's the artist who needs that, but it was also Shanoa who got her first bibliography line as a young writer too, which is great. My other question though was just before we end, can you tell us about knitting? Because I'm a curator of craft and I really want to know how you got there. When did you start knitting?
My mother taught me to knit. My mother knitted for a while. She made herself, this must have been the 50s, you know, at a time when knit suits were all the rage, and she knitted herself a knit suit. But she stopped and I stopped. But then in the 1980s, when I lived in North Carolina, I never could find clothes I wanted. And so I realized that I would have to knit them myself. I was not thinking about art school at that time, but I remember walking in one of the streets and seeing a shop that had all this fantastic color and texture. It was a yarn shop. And I went in, and Luann, we're still in touch. This is from the 80s. Luann said, "You buy yarn, I'll teach you to knit." And I've been knitting ever since. It's kind of, it's like meditation. It keeps my sanity. It's soothing. And we've gotten to the point where we have so many sweaters, we sort of push them on friends now. Something I have against global warming, actually.
I love that story. I have a theory. I'm doing a research project just now called Craft Schools, where I ask a lot of different people how they came to their craft practice, like who their most important teacher was. And 9.5 times out of 10, they say their mother or their grandmother, and they've met that person obviously within the first seconds of their lives. So it's not necessarily in art school that they become an artist, or they start their creative life before they get to a space like that.
Well, in the National Book Awards, one of the finalists is Taya Miles, The Thing She Carried. Oh, look at it. It's about a cloth sack, actually, that a mother gave to her daughter who was being sold away in, I think, 1854. It's one of the finalists. So if you can't remember the name, just look for the nonfiction finalists of the National Book Award.
Thank you for that recommendation. I'll go find it tonight. And Rachel, I hand back to you.
No, thank you. We've come up just at 7 p.m., but there literally is absolutely no better way to end the conversation than with our mothers, grandmothers, and knitting. So I truly want to thank you, Nell, for your time. You're engaging with us. To be continued, I hope. And thanks everyone on the screen for joining us. That was really, really wonderful.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you, all of you.